My guest today is Professor Ellen Armour, who is professor and chair of Feminist Theology at Vanderbilt Divinity School. She also directs the Carpenter Program in Religion, Gender, and Sexuality. In addition to Seeing and Believing, which is the topic of our conversation today, she is the author of Signs and Wonders, Theology After Modernity, that was featured in the previous podcast. Welcome, Ellen.
Thank you. Delighted to be here with you, Gill.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So this book is Seeing and Believing is sort of at the intersection of a variety of topics, politics, religion, race, and photography, which is an odd mixture of things. Mm-hmm. I didn't read the book in detail. I just skimmed it. But I want to start with, so we go through the book in stages. So your first chapter is entitled Setting the Stage. Mm-hmm. And here's a quote in here. It says, human beings live in a world that is simultaneously real and virtual, mm-hmm. material and symbolic, sensate and mediated. Mm-hmm. This is a very relevant quote by Robert Harmon. Mm-hmm. And so, I mean, this says a lot of things, right? I mean, the first thing here is real and virtual. I think we are in a world that is mixing these two things in many areas. I read something in the news today that there is some talk about, the deep fake political ads need to be regulated. Because most mm-hmm. people don't really know what is real and what's fake. And so set the stage for us. But so what mm-hmm. do you mean by setting the stage?
Mm-hmm. Well, you said it as well as I could right there. It's just trying to outline a bit and describe a bit what are the challenges that we face because of the convergence of the real and the virtual. We talk about our real lives as though they are in some way separate from our virtual lives, but that boundary is, as you said, very blurry at best. I start out that chapter talking about, the urgency of things that particularly struck me, I think, in 2020, around the time of the January 6th insurrection, which was organized on social media, for example, right? And then had these real life effects. And yet, the response to that has been really remarkably divided, right? There are some folks who believe that it was, in fact, an insurrection. There are other folks who think it was a perfectly justified thing. So this question of truth, of what's true and what's not, is really, really critical. And it's in part, too, related to the issues of photography, too, right? We talk about fake news, but we also have to talk about, and the concern about what we call now deep fakes is getting to be, if anything, more acute now with AI. And that has to do with the specifics of the technologies and the availability of digital photography and what you can do with it and do to it, and its nature, which is in some ways very similar to analog, and in other ways technologically very different, and that makes all the difference in terms of the challenges that we face. So that's basically what I'm trying to outline in that first chapter, is just, talk about. And I even ask, questions like, news. Facebook used to call used to talk about your news feed. It would give you your news feed. And one question I pose in there is what Facebook is feeding me really nurturing me, or is it, what is it? And, it's mixed. We are able to keep up with friends we wouldn't otherwise be able to. Because of, Facebook. We're able to make connections that we otherwise wouldn't be able to make because of social media. And that's great. So that's the other side of it. So the basic question for the book is, how can we first understand better, get more literate about the challenges of seeing and believing? Can we believe what we see on social media? That's a real question. How can we get more literate about that? But also, how can we make the most of what some people call the affordances of social media, what it makes possible, while minimizing its the problems that come with it?
Yeah, so this analog versus digital photography is an important consideration, right? So analog, I don't quite know this, but maybe 200 years ago is when we got the first photograph.
Pretty close,
digital, about that, but digital is about, say, 50, 60 years ago.
Yeah, right.
And I was looking at something that you said here, I can't remember which chapter, that in analog photo, you can, when you zoom into it, you get more and more information. Whereas in digital, when you zoom into it, you lose more and more information.
That's right.
That's an important thing, isn't it?
Yes, it is. The similarities and differences are really important, and I think the differences are particularly crucial when it comes to what I call here and in my previous book, Signs and Wonders, photographic truth, right? And we think that we can take photographic truth for granted, right? We think that, well, what happens when you take a photograph? You pick up, in this case, your digital camera, your cell phone typically, point it at whatever you're seeing that you want to capture, click on the shutter, we call it, though it's not a shutter, right, in real life, and boom, you have it, right? That's it. So basically, it's a point and click thing. But the issue is then, what does it really mean? What is that artifact that you're creating, and in what sense is it an artifact? So, like with analog photography, as you mentioned, analog, the real camera, if you want to call it that, right? The original camera did indeed capture way more than even the photographer intended to capture, and you saw that whenever you would enlarge it, more detail would show up, not less. And you also another thing with analog photographs is the relationship between the original and the copy, right? Again, folks who aren't familiar with analog photography may not remember how this works, but to get the photograph itself, first there's a negative on film, right? And you have to submit that to chemical reactions in order to get it to transfer the negative to paper. And we call it a negative because what's dark in the photograph is actually light in the negative, and what's light in the photograph is dark in the negative. So it's the absolute inverse, right, of the photograph. But then you get the photograph. The first print is the cleanest, the clearest, the best. So in the world of art photography, you will see that the artist always puts, the number of the print, because you can reprint it a whole bunch of times, right? That's because as you print more and more copies, they degrade over time. They get worse, right? The quality gets worse. That is not true with digital photographs. You can copy and copy and copy and copy, and there's no way to know which is the original and which is the copy. There's no way. And here's the best part. To make an analog photograph, you have to have an object, you have to have light. Hence photograph, light writing, right? You need neither of those to create a digital photograph. You can create a digital photograph out of whole digital cloth, just out of bits, right? Yeah. So, which raises the question, in one sense, should we even call them photographs at all, right? Light writing. So there you go. Not to mention how easy it is, just really easy it is to to fiddle with and adjust a photograph, a digital photograph. It's much harder with an analog photograph. It requires some special skills and special tools. That's not true with a digital photograph. So here you go. There's the crisis. There's the question.
Yeah, so that's so interesting, Ellen. So it goes into sort of the fakeness question, right? So the analog photo, you say, when you copy more and more, the copies are not exactly the same. They are slightly different.
Right.
Whereas in the digital world, they're exactly the same.
That's right.
And so the digital thing is fundamentally a fake in the sense that only a fake can be purely replicated, right? So if you say the analog photo is the first one is distinct from the second one, there is really no fakeness there, right? So all the fakeness come back to digital, and we're in a digital world today. So this goes into a social media issue. And is a digital photo, is it a photo, or is it a container of information or pixels that could be manipulated by software or artificial intelligence or whatever, right? So they're two different products, aren't they?
They are really in many ways. And yet we don't think about them as two different products typically, but they really are. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, most of what we see online probably is, taken is a cell phone photograph or something like that of something that really happened. But even though that's the case, there are plenty of opportunities to do other things with it. You may remember Pizzagate.
Yeah.
Right. So, which was a manufactured crisis that sent a guy to the basement. He was sure that Hillary Clinton and somebody else, I don't remember who else, were involved in human trafficking, child trafficking, and they were holding these kids in a basement in a pizza parlor. And he went there with a gun. And, there were pictures he saw that made him think that. And that's all just, hokum. So, but that makes you realize how serious this is. And you've seen, too, you were mentioning, political ads that are running now that are fake. And well, at least somebody knows that they are, and the word's getting out. But that is not, we can't be sure. So you really always have to do your due diligence to see whether what you see is really real or not.
Yeah, but the Pizzagate thing, I mean, I didn't quite follow it, but there were no photographs, right? I mean, it was somebody's view or somebody's opinion over the airwaves.
Right.
You say here, but seeing and believing isn't just about whether we can trust what we see. It also pertains to how we respond to what we see.
That's right.
And we are in a world that people respond to anything. Any stimulus, whether you're seeing or hearing or imagining.
Right.
Right. Actually, there are a lot of medications. I mean, about 15% of the country are on medications because they perceive things. Yeah, seeing is some component of it. But if you come back to the political and religious question around it. How did the visual part of it really influence? I'm talking about religion. Religion perhaps started, I don't know, 20,000 years ago.
At least, yeah.
Yeah, it's a good component of 8 billion people today. Just the audience know, I grew up as a Catholic. I consider myself an agnostic, so they know my bias. But how does religion and photography come together?
Well, at least two ways in this book. The first is, we talk about certain photographs as iconic, right? And we mean by that, and well, in fact, one scholar defines them as these photographs that kind of capture a really critical moment in time with such pathos and power that they don't even, to use the title of the book, they don't even need a caption, no caption needed. So an example of an iconic photograph, one would be Migrant Mother. You might have seen that one, of Depression era photograph of a woman who is obviously really, really poor and holding her baby and just looking so thoughtful and pensive. And that photograph was taken by a WPA photographer Dorothea Lange, and it was credited with really mobilizing folks to support the New Deal. And if you look at that photograph, obviously the term iconic is a term that comes from religion, right? And it's and oftentimes the photographs that really move us, like that become iconic, have a religious echoes to them. So that particular photograph, for example, will call to mind to folks familiar with Christian iconography, the Pietà, a picture of Mary holding Jesus. So that's one example. Another example of an iconic photograph that you will recognize too is Napalm Girl. That's from the Vietnam War. And of a girl running naked through the streets after a napalm explosion and holding her arms down, you know. And that one recalls in some ways the crucifixion narratives, right? You know, just to cite those as a couple of examples of iconic photographs. And the way that we relate to photographs like that is interesting too, because they mobilize belief, right, for us in the same way that icons, religious icons, mobilize belief for the faithful who consider them to be iconic, right? They move us to feel certain ways, to take action sometimes, but they don't always move us in the same direction. And that's true of icons as well, right? Seeing and believing is anchored in a photographic storyline, I call it, that starts with the killing of Trayvon Martin. And you'll remember that, right? Well, the killing of Trayvon Martin was not photographed, so we don't have any photographic evidence related to that. But it ended up being one of the events that really launched the Black Lives Matter movement, right? That's big. And that was one of the most the largest protest movement in American history, and really was a global movement too. Not coincidentally, it's hashtag Black Lives Matter, right? It started out as a hashtag on Twitter and mobilized all these people. But Trayvon Martin's photograph was really kind of central to that. A selfie of him in his gray hoodie, looking seriously and pensively into the camera, right? Nicole Fleetwood has done a beautiful analysis of that photograph and talks about it as a kind of religious icon in some ways, right? Okay, so it launched the Black Lives Matter storyline, right, the movement, but it also, that photograph prompted Dylann Roof to go down this deep rabbit hole that got him, you know, all engaged with white supremacy and led to the murdering of 9 people at the Mother Emanuel Church in South Carolina. And Dylann Roof, and what he did, inspired a man in New Zealand to go into a mosque and kill a whole bunch of Muslim people who were worshiping there. So that's what I mean by photographs. The very same photograph can move us in very different ways, emotionally and to take action. And that's what I call photographic iconicity, right? All photographs have that capacity, but certain ones really do it, right? And we've just talked about several. And if you think too about Dylann Roof's own selfie that he posted alongside his manifesto, it's him sitting on a rock, holding a gun and holding the Confederate flag and looking straight into the camera, you know, like, come on, you know, pay attention to this. This is important. You know, what are you going to do about it? So again, these 2 iconic photographs really capture in some ways the different ways that photographic storylines can unfold and continue to unfold for a long, long time after the photograph was taken.
So let me get political just for a minute, Ellen. So this mobilization thing is a big threat to autocrats. Mm-hmm. It's less of a problem in a democracy. Mm-hmm. In the latest count, maybe 60 to 2/3 of the world's population living under autocrats. Mm-hmm. We narrowly escaped it here in the US. We might be on our way back. Right. So mobilization and really kind of visual media-based mobilization mm-hmm. is a big threat to any regime that is not democratic.
Right.
And we see, the signs of all of this all around the world, right? So press freedom is related to that. They want to control the media. Media is a big threat to many of these regimes. So, but once they get hold of that mechanism, this goes back to seeing as believing question. They can feed information, digitally altered, or however you want to do it, to the masses, right? So it has become a way to control large populations. And I wondered if we are sort of in that path, because democracies appear to be dying all around the world.
Yeah, and it's a really interesting and that it's a very astute observation about what's going on in autocratic regimes. And this is a place where we can think about or talk about the affordances of social media too, right? Because people in those that are subject to those autocratic regimes often turn to social media as they're able, right? And that can be tricky, right? But often turn to social media to get access to other sources of information. And that can be, again, whether you can trust those sources of information is always a question, of course. But we've seen that play out too in the current conflict in Russia, around Russia and Ukraine. And we see that play out too in a lot of autocratic regimes. There's a really great book. I don't know if you know well, she's a scholar, but she also writes for a lot of for newspapers. Zeynep Tufekci. She's written a book. Yeah, she's really good. She's written a book called Twitter and Tear Gas that I talk about, in which she talks about the power of social organizing, and her specific example is the Arab Spring, and how important social media was to that global movement, right? There were people who were able to support the activists on the ground there, who were able to do that. I mean, send them medical supplies, food, all kinds of stuff because of social media, right? And that's really crucial. On the other hand, she's also very clear that social media are not, or social connections made by social media are not a substitute for real life flesh and blood connections too. She herself was part of the Arab Spring, was on the ground kind of observing what was going on. And one of the things that she observed was that how many activists who already knew each other from other kinds of global events were there and all working together. So I think the best way, this is to think about the affordances of social media. For all of its problems, it really can mobilize movements. Black Lives Matter is just one example. The Arab Spring is another one. But that ability to do it and to sustain it, right, and to make change, right, that's where the real problem comes in. That's where the limitations start to come in and show themselves. Because again, as you're saying, in an autocratic regime, I mean, you can look and see what's happened with the Arab Spring, right? Not the kind of systemic change at all that people were hoping for. Or think about Occupy Wall Street, not the kind of systemic change that people were hoping for. Black Lives Matter has yet to produce the kind of systemic change people are hoping for and working for. So it's not a substitute for, but it sure can make an impact, and it sure can bring people together. So, that's the good side.
Yeah, but mobilization goes in both directions. It could go in a positive way. It could also go in a negative way, as we have witnessed in the US.
That's right.
And so the larger question is social media, does it have a net positive effect on society or not, right? I mean, it's a tough question, but what is your perspective on that?
Well, my basic perspective is it's really interesting to think about this, because I would say that social media is basically human beings on steroids. And so it has all the good stuff that comes with being human and all the bad stuff that comes with being human. And it's all out there, and it's all doing whatever it's going to do, right? And the other piece of it, though, is one of the issues we have to consider, too, is thinking about social media. What kind of a system is it exactly? Like, we talk about social media as our new public square, right? Because of what we just described, our ability to, that's really where most of us get our media these days. That's where we get most of our information. That's where we go to organize so often. So it is, in many ways, our new public square. But who's running this public square? We may think of it as like, we just get on, yeah, we have to pay to have access to the internet, and we have to pay to have our cell phone, but we just get on and use Facebook and we don't pay anything, right? It's free, right? Well, it's not. All of these social media platforms are owned by these multinational corporations, and so they are all monetized. And what they want, what they want is your attention. They want your eyes on something. And if they have your eyes on something, then they can sell that to advertisers, and that's how they make their money. So that means that, and as we've seen, these behemoths of social media really struggle when it comes to policing content. They're really often reluctant to police content, and for good reason, because what catches our eyes, right, in this attention economy, it's called, right? What catches our eyes is what outrages us. It's what really, it's that gives a big emotional charge. That's what was going to get them the most money. And so their algorithms are kind of, tweaked in some ways, often to kind of give us that, right? And then when it comes to biases, right, there's been a lot of research on the degree to which the biases that are present in the human community are also present online. There's a really great book out there by Sophia Noble called Algorithms of Oppression, where she traces what she calls digital redlining. And digital redlining is exactly that kind of thing, where just like redlining in mortgages and stuff, drew lines and prevented people of color from buying real estate at the same level and in the same ways, and getting mortgages in the same ways that white people were able to, and we're still living in the effects of that. Digital redlining does something similar, right? There are a couple of searches she describes. For example, one she was about to have her niece and some friends of hers over, and so she Googled young Black girls to see what kind of content she could get to show them and they could play with. Well, what showed up were porn sites. I mean, that's terrible. Well, Google fixed that, right? Google fixed that. It's kind of amazing. But those algorithms, and Google's got its own problems. All these tech companies do with their own workforce not being sometimes diverse enough, right? To be able to do what they need to do. Google's camera, the Pixel camera, it turned out, it took a couple of years for people to discover this. Well, actually, I'm not sure how long it took, but it took a while. Was not sensitive enough to darker skinned people in the way that it was with white skinned people. Well, why didn't it occur to somebody to test the camera on people with all kinds of different skin colors so that you could see whether it would work and ensure that it did? So that's what I mean. The biases that are present in our world, in our real life world, are definitely present online, and in some ways, accelerated and amplified sometimes online. So how you draw the line between are social media ultimately a good thing or a bad thing remains to be seen, and it kind of depends very much on the context and on what's going on. And again, I go back to this, who's monetizing it, who's controlling it. One author has calls this surveillance capitalism. and that is what it is. That's an apt description of what social media are. And, because we are also under surveillance 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, right? Anytime we've got right now, somebody else is paying attention sort of to what's going on. So yeah, it's complicated. It's complicated.
It is complicated. I'm a bit conflicted about this, Helen. So content moderation assumes somebody else has more knowledge to moderate properly. It might have been the case maybe, 20, 30, 40 years ago. It's unclear if that's the case anymore.
That's right.
And in a regime where you have deep fake that looks exactly real, moderation is not going to be helpful. Moderation might create more problems. Then the question is, like you say, like you ask, who controls this?
Right.
Those with good initial conditions. So, maybe 20 companies in the US control most of the information today, if not the GDP. 100 people control 90% of India's GDP, potentially another democracy. So these people with such good initial conditions could moderate their way out of anything that they want, right? So you could actually create a world for the other 8 billion who couldn't know what is real and what's fake anymore.
Right.
So where do you stand on this? Yeah.
Well, I think that's also a really good question. So many of these companies tend to rely on us to do the regulation, So a lot of them have mechanisms by which you can report, something like, you can report spam, you can report phishing, all that kind of thing. And they also, some of them have at least a small staff that is charged with trying to, enforce whatever rules they have in place. But yeah, it's really, really difficult. I think about this a lot these days with AI and what, the challenges that are going to come with it. I think it would be good to at least, and thinking about Twitter too, right? Back before Elon Musk bought it, you had to pay or whatever, you got a badge if you were actually really the person, that you were purported to be. There are mechanisms that we can put in place that would be not terribly invasive and that wouldn't necessarily limit speech at all, but might help people understand or put the speech in context. Is this a source that I can trust, right? Or is this something produced by AI? It would be if the chat GPT produced it, it ought to say that at the bottom, so that's where it came from. So I think there are ways of doing it that would not necessarily be, removing stuff, although I think some things probably really do need to be removed. But that would be more, amenable to concerns about free speech, but also amenable to concerns about privacy. Thinking about that's a really crucial thing. In the EU, they have, for example, they have tighter regulations in the EU than we have in the US, for sure. I don't know about India or other countries, but there is, for example, in the EU, a right to be forgotten. We don't have that in the US at all. So, we're going to live online eternally, it's kind of,
I want to ask you about that. So, so we have 8 billion people. I can envision a world where there is 80 billion deepfake robots superimposed on the 8 billion real people, let's say. So we might be fast approaching a regime where people don't really matter. They are small numbers in the grand scheme of things. So whether they created some real content, whether that is preserved, destroyed, in the grand scheme of things, none of those things probably matter in 10, 15, 20 years from now, because everything online would be essentially deep fake, because there is no real value in reality. So you have in the second chapter here, you say, in our culture of simulation, which I like a lot.
Yeah.
It's a quote by Sherry Turkle.
Yeah.
You say the notion of authenticity is for us what sex was for the Victorians, threat and obsession, taboo and fascination, which is very, very relevant. The notion of authenticity, we have some peripheral notions of that now, but we are going into a black hole from where there is really no return. So where do you stand on that?
Well, that again, I think that's an even more real threat now with AI than it would have been a few years ago. And I guess I'm of mixed minds on that. On the one hand, at least as long as humans are around, I think that desire for connection, that desire for authenticity, that desire for real connection is not going to go away, at least between us, and between us and in many ways, a lot of other stuff out in the world too. So it could be that as more and more, digital content becomes, the norm and dominates the world. I mean, it really already does. So, kind of does. I'm wondering if that might actually feed a hunger for real in-person content, real in-person connection. And so I guess I think it remains to be seen. The other thing that we always also have to bear in mind is, at least now, this may change with AI, although in some ways, that's one of the things that people are still debating. At least for now, all of what's on social media, all the content that's online is ultimately human at its root. It doesn't mean it's not transformed or changed by being mechanized and all that, but there is a degree to which the online environment is really parasitic on the real world, at least right now. And again, with AI, that could change depending on how smart, quote unquote, the those technologies get in their ability to do things. But I guess I kind of wonder. There's debate now about the degree to which chatbots and whatnot can we call them yet sentient beings, right? Are they there yet? And it's a real question because of some of the interactions that people have had as they're trying out these new technologies. And it's creepy, and it definitely goes in the direction that you're talking about, for sure, right? So, I guess it really does remain to be seen. I think there's good reason to be cautious about it and scared about it and nervous about it, and to really want some serious regulation of these mechanisms. But at the end of the day, it may not stop what you're envisioning, the kind of Orwellian world that is to come. It could be.
Yeah, I mean, you have a chapter in here entitled "Remaking Us," which is very relevant. Regulations for me, again, presupposes, just like moderation of content, presupposes somebody else has the knowledge to optimize. And what we know from regulations in other areas, it appears pretty ad hoc in many ways, right? So I don't know if the fundamental question remains, are humans, the current state, are humans really relevant? Question number one. If they're not really relevant, then is there, as you say here, a remaking us that needs to be started?
Yeah. Well, it's a good question. I think I think first we need to pay attention to the way that we are being remade already, right, by this new social media world. Like the fact that we are online, or at least assumed to be available in some way 24/7, right? And the line between, say, our work life and our home life is kind of, you know, erased in many ways. And the ways that we are being remade, Sherry Turkle is very much concerned about what it's doing to our power of empathy. When you have families sitting around at night and everybody's on their own screen, right? I mean, what sort of interaction is that? What are kids growing up as digital natives, as we call them now? What are they going to be like when they get older? And she is a sociologist who's done some studies with people and social media, and she's got evidence that it actually does inhibit empathy to spend too much time on our screens. So those are just a couple of the ways in which we are being remade. Eli Pariser talks about us being enclosed in filters on the internet too. Again, this is a function of algorithms, because the surveillance media capitalists want our attention, and so they put us into these bubbles that they think are going to give us what we want, so we'll engage with social media more and more. And so that's happening too, and that's certainly a big part of what's creating these massive divisions and polarizations in political polarizations and divisions that we're seeing everywhere. And of course, as you pointed out a while ago, we're seeing kind of the rise of autocracies, the rise of fascism, the rise of all kinds of political movements that are really troubling. But again, that have a history, right? They're not new, they have a history. And they're as much a part of our complicated human history as anything else. So, and what will regulation do? What will moderation do to help us with that? Again, we're talking about human beings, right? Trying to do something. And it's certainly not going to fix everything. No amount of regulation will, and I don't think we have to presume that the people who will do it know more than we do. But at least if we had, and I think when you look at what some of these boards are doing, they're really wrestling with, like, for example, wrestling with whether or not to ban President Trump from Twitter back in the day after the January 6th insurrection. That was a really, really hard and tough decision, a really hard and tough question. To see what Google did in response to being aware of young Black girls was producing this kind of content, and then they tinker with the algorithm to fix that. There are examples of moderation and maybe not regulation yet at this point, but some efforts on the parts of the human beings who created these things in some way and who benefit from them that can ameliorate some of the harms that they can do. And I think that's a good thing. It's never going to be a perfect world, right? We're never going to get the perfect level of, it's always going to be a moving target in some ways. But at least if we try, then that's better than nothing. There will always be, then it's going to come back to the individual prosumer, as we call ourselves now, right? We produce and consume what we see on social media. To take responsibility for what we share, and to again be literate about what we see, what we consume, and that's always going to be the case. So it's a multi-layered thing, just like the real world, right? Yeah.
Yeah, let me push on this tangent a little bit, Helen. So you mentioned empathy. If we suppose as humans are empathetic, data tells us that Homo sapiens out of Africa, 500,000 years, they killed off every other Homo variety that we know existed. So empathy arrived to us maybe very, very recently, maybe a few thousand years, perhaps. So empathy, I would argue, is not a basic characteristic of a Homo sapien. And given the freedom to return to the wild, so to speak, that is where we are. We're returning to the digital wild. Homo sapiens, I believe, will return to their natural traits, which is local optimization, localization of everything, resources, everything. And so the digital world might be providing an avenue to return back to 500,000 years ago, where there was no empathy in that process.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's certainly something that could happen. I mean, I think I also think this is one place where I think thinking about the human beings as animals is helpful, because animals we're learning are much more complicated beings than we thought they were. So elephants grieve, for example. We've learned that elephants grieve. The kinds of care that monkeys give to babies, or that in fact that all animals give to their offspring, is something to see and something to pay attention to. So I guess I think the kind of empathy that we might think of it as cross-species empathy, so to speak. That's a rarer thing, to be sure, but we even see that in animals. Animals of different species that bond and that work together. So I guess I would be inclined to think and thinking again about this digital landscape. It's easier in some ways to focus on the negatives, and the negatives are huge. They're massive, but there are also positives. And so, there are, for example, lots of instances of people who find connections online that they wouldn't otherwise have made, and that are really, life-giving for them. And I'm not thinking just of dating apps and stuff, but which are real. Everybody I know who has met somebody new in the last 10 years has met them through some dating app, right? And oftentimes that ends up in very happy relationships that last a long, long time. So great. But my point is simply that that it's a mixed bag. It really is a mixed bag, and I guess my inclination is to think that mixture is going to continue, and it will always be, at one and the same time, one of the nastiest places you can imagine, and also one of the most life-giving places that you can imagine. And as creatures who inhabit, not only the natural world, but this virtual world, we're going to be impacted by both. And so, you may be right that the bad stuff will win out, and we're going to turn into, these creepy, pre-empathetic, selfish monsters.
That's a good point.
Or we may.
Yeah. So, I mean, from an evolutionary perspective, as you say, we can observe animals, they appear fairly empathetic in many ways, and hence Homo sapiens have that hardware. So when you assemble neurons to some level, I mean, we don't know about bacteria and things like that, but when you assemble neurons at some level, there is some sophistication in those interactions, and hence Homo sapiens must have had it. The question is this new trend that we are on, will it destroy it or will it enhance it? That's the part that's very unclear, right?
That's right. Yeah,
So
that's right. And go ahead.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to say, I think this is one of the things that I really am. I mean, it really does motivate me big time. It's one of the reasons I wrote the book. It's one of the reasons I do what I do is, I want to help us navigate these challenges and these complexities in as positive a way as we can. And here again, I think turning back to something that's really, really old, in this case, religion, can really help us navigate that. And so, it's kind of surprised, and to me, honestly, it was a surprise that I would turn to religious ways of seeing, to help us navigate the challenges on social media in terms of what we're seeing and believing. But I do, and I turn there in part because, again, if you think about religion, and what does the word religion mean? Its etymology is from religio, which is to bind. So it's something that binds us together, right? And as you were saying, religions have been around for whatever, 20,000 years. Who knows? They've been around a very long time, and that would probably only be the ones that we actually recognize as religions, right? And don't get me started on that. But but probably, human beings have been trying to navigate, relationships between themselves and the real world and what they perceived as, the forces that are, at work in that world since Homo sapiens came into being, probably even before they had language, who knows? So again, we've got this ancient resource that we can pull on, and seeing has been crucial to that also since the beginning. Just to talk about Christianity, for example, Christianity has its beginnings in a crisis around seeing and believing. What to make of an empty tomb, right? Where you're expecting to see, this dead Messiah, and he's gone. What do we make of this? What do we make of this? Well, you see what happened, right? And so many of the conflicts in Christianity, as well as in other religions, are conflicts over whether something is an icon or an idol, right? And so, we've got, and I'm just talking about Christianity, but certainly other religions have very important traditions around seeing. Think about darshan and how important that is in Hinduism, or the prohibition in Judaism and in Islam of any kind of depiction of the divine, right? As in any kind of way. So, and yet in Islam, for example, calligraphy is really important way to decorate temple, decorate mosques, and then think about the way we've always used architecture too, to convey religious messages, and that's all about seeing and believing. So that we've got these ancient resources too, and what if we use them? So what I argue in the I guess it's the last chapter is that turning to religious ways of seeing might help us navigate the challenges, particularly when it comes to what we see in terms of photographs. And particularly when it comes to photographs that move us emotionally and maybe to take action, right? That prompt belief in that kind of way. And one of the ways that I think that it does that religious ways of seeing do that, the crucial thing, insight, is that they all disrupt the hierarchy of seer over seen. And that's in a sense what's happening to us when we encounter some photograph that just stops us dead in our tracks and makes us look, right? And makes us just puzzle and wonder and whatever react, right? That has become in some way, more powerful than we are, and or at least we're experiencing it that way. So, so being a bit more deliberate about how we engage with photographs could work for that. But it's really important too, even though I turn to religious ways of seeing, that these ways of seeing be ways of seeing that come naturally to us, that we're already using, even though we don't have language for it, even though we don't recognize that we're doing it. And that's very true of this particular visual repertoire. I have to give a shout out to my colleague David Morgan at Duke University, who is the source of this visual repertoire of gazes that he finds in Christianity, but also finds in other religious traditions too, and that he argues are basically gazes, ways of seeing that come naturally to us, repurposed for religious purposes. So, so that kind of intervention, I think, is really critical I'd love it if people read this book and, oh, I'm going to try the devotional gaze now, or I'm going to, try the communal gaze or whatever. But, but even if they're not, just actually thinking about what is moving me about this photograph? What do I see in it? What is it moving me to do? What is it moving me to feel, and why? Can really, I think, is a really crucial survival strategy, to be honest, in this very complicated, difficult world that we've been describing and discussing, this socially mediated new public square. Yeah.
Yeah, I want to ask you something on that. But before that, I was wondering, before 1800s, we didn't have a way to record visual signals. We had a great camera.
Right.
It's the human eye. But the storage of the stuff that came through the eye had a lot of noise that the brain imparted on that noise and then stored in the brain. It's not very reliable from a replication perspective.
Right.
And so before 1800, we had no way to really say something happened or something did not happen. But since 1800, we have some way, but you could always manipulate it, one way or the other. But there is some hard evidence of something, right? Now we are returning to a regime, I would argue, which is like before 1800, because the digital stuff can be relied on because it can be deep fake, right? So we lost, between 1800 and 1950, let's say, we had a period where we had some real evidence of something. Now we are back to where we started in some ways. Do you agree with that?
Well, yeah, yes and no. I guess I would say that first of all, we assume that about photography, but people were very suspicious of analog photography when it first came into existence too. They weren't confident at all that it would, that it had that capacity, and it took a lot of work for that to get established. And it was basically in putting photography to use in certain ways that that made that happen. And I talk about that a lot. If you really want to geek out, you can read that chapter in Signs and Wonders where I talk about photography and what it did to us, because it also remade space and time and remade us too, in terms of even the way that we see, the way we think we see. So that's always been an issue. But you're exactly right. Digital photography really just puts that on steroids, big time, just big time. So this is why we have to do our due diligence, right? Again, it doesn't mean that everything we see online, that every photograph we see is a fake one, but we really need to pay attention. Where did this thing come from? Who's posting it? Where did they get it? What evidence do we have? And back in the day too, right? We had most of what we saw, like, was the work of journalists. It really mattered, right? Was the work of photojournalists, and so editors were determining whether this was legit, whether we could post it, whether it should be published, et cetera, right? And they still do that. It's interesting though now, so much of what they publish in terms of photographs is often from, social media stuff that cropped up, but they do their due diligence to make sure that it's real, right? So it's not that everything's fake. It's that we have to exercise some discretion and some insight and some literacy to determine whether what we're seeing is real or not. And it's going to be hard. That's the problem. That's really the problem. It's going to be hard because there's so much of it out there. It is, it's a visually saturated public square, big time. So figuring out what's real and what's not is going to be tough.
Yeah, I mean, the problem is, sort of I don't know, initial conditions is the right word, but there are a lot of very powerful and very rich people.
Yes.
Who have an incentive to manipulate that information.
Mm-hmm.
And the gains are very clear. So they're
Right.
not really going to go away from it. So,
Right.
you have sort of a bifurcated world where, if you take 8 billion, maybe 10 million of those can do whatever they want, really, in the current juncture.
Yeah.
And in such a situation, the 8 billion minus 10 million, how do they survive? I mean, how do they survive in this information, sea of information that is mostly fake, basically?
Yeah. Well, there again, I think that it's going to take a multi-layered approach. It really is. That's why, government regulation is going to be really important. And again, the EU is doing more of this than the US is. And in part, that's related to money, I'm sure, because of tech people, doing a lot of political organizing or political sponsorships and stuff like that. As well as political division. So there's going to have to be some government regulation. The companies, too, are going to have to, and have to do their part. You might remember Google's slogan originally was "Do no evil," right? So, and there are companies that are trying, right? I mean, the gains that a number of these tech companies have made in diversifying their workforce are not insignificant. That's important. The ways that they are trying to moderate content, is important, and it's a delicate balance that they're trying to walk, a fine line they're trying to walk, and that's not going to be easy. And then we have to do our part. We have to do our due diligence. Is this a source I can trust? Why should I trust it? What is this really about? And I taught a Sunday school class recently, and one of the adults in the Sunday school class said one of the things that she does is actually subscribe to multiple news sources so that she can see what Fox News is saying. She can see what CNN is saying, what MSNBC is saying. And, that's one way to do it, is to kind of, see what's out there and try as best you can to avoid or to trouble the boundaries of your particular filter bubble so that you might get to see more than you normally would. So there are ways of doing it, but you're right, it's going to be a bigger challenge than it ever has been for us. And so much of the labor is going to fall to us, it really is.
Yeah, so let me close with this, Erin. I know I'm pushing it a little bit, but so if you have AI-driven bots who is investing in the stock market, who is putting ads on Facebook, let's say, all these entities are going to be catering to AI-driven bots. They're going to be rich. I mean, they're spending money, they're making money. The human relevancy question, I mean, this is an AI policy issue, ultimately. Are humans becoming less relevant for the world? And the data is sort of ambiguous right now, but the trends are pretty scary in many ways, right? What do you think about that?
Well, this could be a case where capitalism might save us in some way, right? I mean, where are they going to get their money if it's not from us somehow or another, right?
Cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Well, okay, then they can go off and do cryptocurrency and whatever. But it's kind of like I guess where I am tempted to land is to say, at the end of the day, there's got to be a real bottom, right? There's got to be a reality that is in some way, even if all it's doing is being monetized somehow. So that is going to be what rates this. Now, I could be completely wrong about that. It could be that we'll enter a world at some point where, and I know this has been part of the AI conversation too. If we get to a place where a whole lot of jobs are really irrelevant now, right? How are we going to how are human beings going to survive? And is just giving everybody a basic minimum income gonna do it? Well, the fact that they're even talking about that again means, we got to be out there buying stuff for this economy to run. So, I mean, again, we will have to see, but there are, it seems to me, some kind of basic realities that that might, might I can see it going a bunch of different ways. It could be that, the human beings all kind of collect over here and we really do go back to something much more primordial and not necessarily, Homo sapiens at its onset, but I'm thinking of colleagues of mine who are saying, okay, you know what, I'm going back to in-class exams. The students are going to sit here and they're going to write their stuff right here in front of me. I am no longer allowing any kind of digital anything in my classroom. Computers, no. You're going to have to take notes by hand and all that. Well, we'll see how that goes. But, so I'm not talking about necessarily all the way back to Homo sapiens, but again, I think this hunger that human beings are going to feel for real connection and for authenticity, I don't think that's going to go away anytime soon. And at least as long as there are human beings around, the value of that and being able to have access to that is probably going to become even more valuable to us than it is now, because we can, to a certain extent, take it for granted now, and there may come a time when we can't take it for granted. I mean, think about even what we went through those first 2 years of the COVID pandemic when we couldn't be physically present with each other, and how hard that was. So that again tells you just how that is.
Sorry to interrupt. So let me ask you this: so could religion be a tool to differentiate between a real human being and a fake one?
That's an interesting question. That's a real interesting question. Well, I think I'm inclined to say yes, because again, if you think about the role that religion has played, for good or ill, in connecting people to each other, that's really its most important function, I think you could argue, right? Connecting people to each other in relationship to a higher purpose, in relationship to a higher meaning, and in a way that answers, or tries to at least, some of the critical questions that human beings inevitably raise. Why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering? How do I cope with all of that? And I guess that's where going back to this question of sentience is really going to be crucial. Will there come a time when artificial intelligence, robots, et cetera, are sentient? Not just that they can, repeat, create, in words, images, or whatever, but where they really feel. And how will we know that? How will we know that? And is that a line that they can cross? I don't know. Again, there's evidence that maybe they can because of some of what we're seeing in AI, but I'm not sure. Certainly, we're seeing evidence that they can be more creative, right? And that's a bit scary. But it's still that I guess I come back to that basic animality of human beings that I'm just not sure can be replicated in the way that, I don't know, in silicone, I guess would be the way to think about it, right? Can it be in silicone, in bytes, in X's and O's? Maybe it can. We'll find out. I don't know. You and I will find out. We may be long gone before it happens, but
Let's hope so. Otherwise, we're in deep trouble.
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Yes. Thanks, Ellen. Thanks so much for spending time with me.
Oh, it was fabulous as always, Gill. I really enjoyed it. And thanks again for the invitation.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.